movie next month, one more lecture next month. And now, I gotta read this real carefully. He really doesn't need any introduction. But here is our favorite rabbi, Michael Panitz.
Good evening, friends.
Good evening.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Even those in the back row? Okay. That's what I needed to see. Someone holding a thumbs up in the back row. That's perfect. I was sharing with Chaplain Uwe and our delightful dinner company earlier that this has come to feel like a reunion of old friends. I so much enjoy these monthly get-togethers. I honestly don't enjoy going through the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. So I make every effort to get through the Bridge Tunnel before 3 p.m. Because otherwise it promotes patience. I'm remembering a history book which was talking about what life was like in the 18th century. And it talked about the vagaries of sea travel in the era of sail. No steam power, but waiting for the tide and for the wind to be right. And one traveler was writing in his journal, next to the state of marriage, sea travel is the best school in patience. Delightful quote. Friends, quick question, quick show of hands. Were you able to see the 1960 film, The Story of Ruth? Okay, because if most hadn't, I would have, couched my lecture differently. But I'll tell you, spoiler alert, she does marry Boaz. And that's one of the only parts of the movie which closely follows the Bible. So let's start by remembering the story of Ruth as we know it from the Hebrew Testament. It's a short story. It's 4 brief chapters. Chapter 1 begins by telling us that there is a famine in the land of Judah at the time of the Judges. Just to give you a historical, chronological sense of this, the exodus from Egypt took place probably in the mid-1200s, before the Christian era. We know from Egyptian evidence that the Israelites were living in the land of Israel by the low 1200s. We know that the first kings of Israel, Saul and David, are around 1000 before the Christian era. So the time of the Judges is the 1100s and the 1000s before the Common Era. So we don't know that from the Bible, we know that from modern archaeological researches. But the story is set, whenever the story was actually written, it was set in the time of the Judges. And the Bible tells us there was a famine, and a particular family leaves Judah. They cross to the east bank of the Jordan River to be in the land of Moab. And the man's name is Elimelech. His wife's name is Naomi. And they have 2 sons, Machlon and Chilion. And within short order, the Bible tells us that Elimelech dies, Machlon dies, Chilion dies, leaving Naomi widowed, and her 2 daughters-in-law as well, the wives of Machlon and Chilion, whose names are Ruth and Orpah. Then the Bible tells us that at a certain point, Naomi decides to go back to Judah. She's heard news that perhaps the famine has ended, and her daughters-in-law are ready to go with her. And in great sadness of spirit, no lack of love, but sadness of spirit, she says to them, don't go with me because I can't care for you here in Judah. I have no sons who can be the levirate marriage husbands for you. I just can't do anything for you. And Orpah tearfully, lovingly bids her mother farewell, but as the Bible says, Ruth clings to her mother-in-law and says, the most famous line in the book, entreat me not to leave you. You know, I swear by God Almighty that where you go, I will go, your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and where you are buried, I'll be buried. Let nothing but death separate between us. It's a very, very famous line. And so they go together back to the land of Judah, where it's almost like a Greek chorus. The women of the village say, is that Naomi? And Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Mara is the Hebrew word for bitterness. Call me embittered, because I've been hollowed out by misfortune. That's the first chapter. In the second chapter, we're introduced to a kinsman of the late Elimelech, whose name is Boaz, who has been blessed with good fortune, and he has a generous spirit. So it turns out that when Ruth, who is begging, she's gleaning, which is what the poor are allowed to do. If you look at the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, and chapter 25, and certain chapters in the book of Deuteronomy, you'll see that the poor had certain rights in ancient biblical society, among them the rights to part of the produce of the field. So for example, there's the law of the corner, that the owner of a field is not allowed to harvest the entire field, but is required to leave a corner unharvested, and that belongs to the poor. Similarly, the law of dropping a sheaf. If the harvester has a bundle of sheaves under his arm and drops a sheaf, that's taken as a sign from heaven that that's meant for the poor. Next time you're fumbling with your purse and drop a $20 bill, try to remember that. So Ruth is gleaning. She's walking after the harvesters. And we see that Boaz is very kind to her. He tells his harvesters, make sure you drop a little bit for her. Make sure that she has what to glean. And if she gets thirsty, make sure she can drink from the water that we have. And Ruth is overcome with gratitude. And she says to him, why are you so kind to me? I'm a stranger to you. And he says, because word has come to me of how good you are to your mother-in-law. So if you remember, Jackie Gleason wasn't so nice to his mother-in-law. To the moon! Remember that? Well, Ruth is not like Jackie Gleason. She is very, very good to her mother-in-law. And he's impressed with her kindness, her loving kindness. And he makes sure that she has a good amount to take back to Naomi. That's chapter 2. Chapter 3, Naomi says, this is really our good fortune. Boaz is kinfolk, and here's what you need to do. And here's where the story gets perhaps a little bit racy. Doll yourself up. Make sure that you're smelling as good as you can. Well, that was very important in a world without running water. And mark where Boaz lies down in the corner of the communal threshing floor area. And in the middle of the night, when it's very dark, go there and lie down next to him and do whatever he tells you. That's all she said. Do you have any idea what that might mean? I mean, I know what it might mean in 21st century secular America. What might it have meant 3,000 years ago in biblical Israel? Maybe the same thing. Who knows? Who knows? The Bible has a masterful way of giving us just a few strokes of a picture, and we're supposed to actively engage the story and fill it in as we think best to fill it in. That's part of the Bible's narrative art. Now, Ruth goes down to the threshing floor, and as the Bible tells us, this is the 3rd chapter, Boaz wakes with a start in the middle of the night. There's a woman at his feet. And it says in the Bible, this is a masterpiece of understatement. She uncovered his feet. But the Hebrew word for feet is the same word as the word for legs. So I ask you, how high did his feet go? So whatever it was she uncovered, he wakens with a start. And then she says something so interesting to him. She says, spread your, literally your wing, but in the sense of your coverlet, your tunic. Spread your cloak over your handmaiden, because you are the one who is supposed to betroth me. You're supposed to marry me. And she knows the law of levirate marriage from the book of Deuteronomy. So she's not trying to be a honey trap, apparently. She's reminding him of his bounden duty to betroth her. And this is a law in Deuteronomy that if a man and woman are married and the husband dies and the woman is childless, his brother is obligated to marry the widow and to do his best that she should have a child. And that child will carry the name of the deceased husband so that his name will not go extinct. We're also told in Leviticus chapter 25 that if someone is so poor as to have to sell his family farm, which is really against the thrust of legislation in Leviticus 25, a kinsman is supposed to buy it back and restore it to the family. It's a form of charity that's commanded of the kinsman. So Ruth is telling Boaz, you are the kinsman who has an obligation to marry me. Now we don't know from Deuteronomy that it extends beyond brother, but apparently it did. According to the book of Ruth, it's any male relative. And I will remind you that the Hebrew Bible is not describing a monogamous society. So if Boaz happened to be married, which we don't know if he is, he may be a widower, but if he's happened to be married, it wouldn't have prevented him from taking care of her in that fashion. Boaz has a very interesting answer. Apparently he's no longer what my grandmother would have called a spring chicken. Apparently he's a good deal older than Ruth. And he says, this kindness of yours is even greater than the last kindness that you displayed, because you're not running after any of the young bucks. I promise you that by tomorrow you will be married properly. But I might not be the husband, because there is another kinsman in the family who is a closer relative to the deceased Elimelech. He has the right of the first, I guess I should say first refusal, but that's not the way the Bible says it. He has the right to be the levirate husband. And if he passes on that, then I assure you it would be my honor to do that. And then he says to her, lest there be any scandal, you need to go back to your mother-in-law's house now while it's still quite dark. And he gives her 6 measures of grain from the threshing floor, and she holds it, in her the fold of her robe, as if she's pregnant, right? As if she has an ample harvest. She goes home, and then we get to chapter 4. The next day, Boaz assembles the townsfolk by the city gate, which is where these public events would take place, and he summons the kinsman, whose name is not given in the Bible. He's known as, this is how you say John Doe in Biblical Hebrew, I love it, Ploni Almoni. Isn't that a lovely expression? Ploni Almoni. It's full of baloney. Which means John Doe, Mr. So-and-so. So he says, Ploni Almoni. And the other man engages him, and he says, here is the widow Ruth, the widow of Machlon, the daughter-in-law of the late Elimelech, and you as the near kinsman are obligated to redeem the field that Elimelech was forced to sell in the family's distress. So the man is apparently wealthy enough to do that. He says, I'll fulfill my duty. And then Boaz says, and you should also know that in doing so, you are also obligated to betroth the widow Ruth. And then Ploni Almoni says, no, that's too much, because I can't impair my own estate that way. So before I narrate the rest of the story, let me explain what that means. Let's say that this man is already married and is raising however many children he has. If he marries Ruth, the first son that they produce is counted as the son of the deceased Machlon, which means that the property that this man inherits is all of a sudden cut in half. And then on top of all of that, he has all of the expenses of raising the child, as well as supporting the mother. He says, that much I can't afford. So Boaz says, well, let's make this official. The same way that we sometimes have an official, you exchange $1, something like that in common law in America. Back then, they would take off the sandal, and that was a gesture of making something official. It's like in America, we'd shake on it, something like that. So Boaz takes off the sandal, and he announces to the assembled group, let it be known that I am the next nearest kinsman, and I am betrothing Ruth. And they marry happily, and they have a son whose name is Oved. And the village women, who are again like the chorus, they're so happy for Naomi because her sadness has been turned to joy, and Naomi becomes the devoted governess, nurse, the local grandma, we might say here, right? I know that some of us love the fact that we are local grandmas and grandpas, and some of us just deal with the fact that our kids live in Los Angeles or across the ocean or someplace like that, right? We just have to deal with that. And if we have the good fortune of being local grandparents, that's very, very good, right? So Naomi enjoys being the local grandmother very much. The story ends on a happy note. And then there's an interesting genealogy. Genealogy starts with the patriarch Judah, his son Zerach, and 10 generations that go from Judah through Boaz to his son by Naomi, Oved, to Oved's son Jesse, to Jesse's son David, who becomes King David. That's how the book ends. You now know more or less the entire book of Ruth. I didn't tell it expansively, I didn't curtail too much either. That's more or less the book of Ruth. It certainly didn't take me the hour and a half that the movie took. So let's consider what the movie is adding. Well, obviously, it's adding spice. It adds the spice of a love triangle. This is the classic Hollywood formula. Do you remember the 1949 DeMille movie, Samson and Delilah, with the strong man Victor Mature and the gorgeous Hedy Lamarr. Remember that? Sure enough, there's a love triangle there too. The Philistine captain and Samson and Delilah, all with each other. And that's the way they told the story. DeMille thought that that was such a successful formula that 7 years later, in the Ten Commandments, which perhaps you do know that film with Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner, he repeats the formula, and you have the love triangle of the Princess Nefertari, who loves Moses, but he loves justice. And you have Ramesses, who loves her, but she loves Moses, but he loves justice, right? And that's the engine that makes that story run. And we were joking with each other before that, how could the Bible have missed that? How could the Bible have missed such an important detail as that they were in a love triangle? This is how Hollywood told stories in the golden age of Hollywood, 1940s through, let's say, 1960s, when the newfangled invention of the television ended that reign that Hollywood enjoyed in American popular culture. And I have to remind you that unlike educational films and documentary films, what makes a movie successful is enough paying customers in the theater. And movie makers like DeMille understood that if you have suds, sex, and spectacle, you're likely to fill the seats in the movie theaters. So, a love triangle, we all want to know. Now, the names in the book of Ruth are interesting, they're symbolic. For example, the other daughter-in-law who leaves at the beginning of the story, remember her name? Orpah. Orpah. But by the way, I think someone's phone is going off here. Yeah, someone right around here has a phone which is going off. So, the word Orpah means back of the neck. It's like naming someone Sayonara. Because what does Orpah do? She leaves. Nice enough, but she exits stage right. Now, Mr. So-and-so, it's not an accident that the Bible denies him a name. He doesn't want to impair his estate. He's not able to transcend himself enough to do the right thing by Ruth. He's never explicitly condemned by the Bible, but implicitly he's written himself out of history. He had the chance to be the great-grandfather of King David, and he blew it. His brush with history was a brush off. And it was his choice. No one forced him. He could have done the extraordinary thing. Instead, he did the ordinary thing. And so his name is lost to us. There's a kind of a poetic justice in that, and it shows you the subtlety of the biblical narrative art. How about the word Ruth itself? Let me remind you of the famous line from the 23rd Psalm. My cup overfloweth. My cup runneth over. Are you familiar with that? Well, the word runneth over, I'm speaking King James now, right? Overflows. The word for overflowing is rivayah, which is from the same Hebrew root as gives us, Hebrew, word stem that gives us the name Ruth. So the word Ruth means overflowing, because her character is overflowing with loving kindness. She shows loving kindness to her mother-in-law, as she had shown loving kindness to her mother-in-law's family before she was widowed. And as the rabbis later commented on the book of Ruth, it's not in the Bible to teach you what is permitted or what is forbidden or what is pure or what is impure. Its sole reason for being in the Bible is to teach you how great is the reward for loving kindness. That's the rabbinic interpretation of the book of Ruth. And I must say, I concur. It's a story about a woman who's distinguished by her quality of loving kindness, and ultimately it's rewarded in the most extraordinary way. So it's really a lovely story in the Bible about extraordinary goodness rewarded. Now, what don't we know from the Bible? So much. We don't know anything about the circumstances of the death of Elimelech, or the death of Machlon, or the death of Chilion. We don't know why Ruth married Machlon. We don't know any of that. And here's where the movie is total free invention. And it's almost half the length of the movie. But I find it very interesting. Not because it's a faithful retelling of the Bible story, but precisely because it gives lavish attention to a question that the Bible awakens, the minimalism of the Bible story awakens in your mind without the Bible at all answering it. And the question is as follows. More than one question. Why Ruth? Is there something providential about Ruth? Is there some God is watching from a distance measure in the fact that she married Machlon? Was God somehow carefully pulling the strings from behind the curtain? That she should be the one who is widowed of Machlon and follows Naomi back to Judah, such that ultimately she will marry Boaz? Is that God making sure that King David's ancestry will be distinguished by that extraordinary goodness? We don't know. But when the Bible ends with the genealogy from Judah to David, it leaves us with a very strong sense that God is active here, even if we can't say precisely how. The movie takes that thought and makes it explicit. So let me remind you of the first two scenes of the movie. Not counting the prologue, where you have this mysterious holy man. I'll get back to him before the end. No, because this movie has a very significant Christian interpretation, and the holy man is connected to that. I'll save that for the end. So we see a man taking his daughter and selling her. Remember that? He's very poor. He sells his daughter to be an acolyte in the service of their pagan god, Chemosh. The name of the god is Chemosh. And that is biblical, that Chemosh was one of the idols that they worshipped. So you see the girl as a little girl amongst all the other acolytes, and then we see something chilling, that one of the priests of Chemosh is going to select a girl to be a human sacrifice. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And he selects Ruth. And then all of a sudden, there's a blemish on her arm. And so she's rejected, and another girl is selected, and Ruth, the little girl Ruth, is upset because she's been indoctrinated, or you would say brainwashed, into thinking that if you are sacrificed to Chemosh, you immediately enjoy eternal life. That's the line they give those little kids. And so she wanted eternal life. She was upset to have lost her chance to be Miss Moab. I mean, imagine if just before Bess Meyerson was crowned Miss America, if suddenly she developed acne and lost the chance to be Miss America. She wouldn't have been too happy, right? So, young girl Ruth is not happy, and then as she's conducted away from the priest, the rash goes away, leaving us with the sense that this is God's work. Right? Then in the very next scene, Ruth is already grown up, and she's a priestess in the service of Chemosh. So as the plot develops, she is the one who's supposed to get a crown for the next generation's little girl who's going to be a sacrifice. And so she negotiates with these Judean gold and silversmiths who happen to be Elimelech and Machlon and Chilion and Naomi. And who knew that their family were smiths and jewelry makers? The Bible didn't tell you that. How could the Bible have missed that? And in the interplay between Machlon and Ruth, she is astounded and insulted by some of his Judean religious values. For example, he disapproves of child sacrifice. Who ever heard of such a thing? To disapprove of child sacrifice. He disapproves when she smacks her maidservant. He says that's. She says, "What? You disapprove of that? How else am I supposed to keep her in line?" And he says, in my people's understanding, she could go free as a result of the injury that you did her because you owe her big. And at first she scoffs at his values, but her heart is troubled. And she begins to think about the invisible God that he's worshiping. At first she thinks that's just, makes no sense at all, an invisible God. It's like, I have an imaginary friend over there, his name is Charlie, right? She thinks about it like that. But then, a moment that's a breaking point for her is when the priest is ready to plunge the dagger into the heart of the little girl that the priestess Ruth has prepared for the sacrifice. She just can't take it. She cries out, which is, of course, a sacrilege in their world, and she's punished for it. So that movement eventually leads her to want to embrace the God of Machlon and his family. See that? By the way, we don't know anything good about Machlon from the Bible itself, or Chilion. And again, we go back to their symbolic names. Machlon means illness. Chilion means extinction. Is that what you named your two boys? Illness and extinction? I mean, maybe if you really didn't want to have them. Oh, I really wanted a girl. So, the Bible doesn't have almost anything to say about them, but the movie makes Machlon a paragon of a higher level of morality, and that's what attracts Ruth. Isn't that an interesting sidebar story to answer the question, why did Ruth marry a stranger? Right? It's like Tony in West Side Story wanting to marry Maria. Right? In that world of New York City, most Tonys would not want to marry most Marias. Right? I'm an American. I'm going to marry a Puerto Rican girl? No. Tony in West Side Story is extraordinary that he looks past that in order to cultivate his love for Maria. That's the Romeo and Juliet story set in Manhattan. So Machlon becomes that kind of extraordinary person, and Ruth becomes the extraordinary person to be entranced, not by his rugged good looks, although that doesn't hurt, but by his values, which she internalizes and which she uses as a powerful critique of her world. And so she is a convert from the world of pagan idolatry to the world of ethical monotheism. That's the point of this movie, which I think is a good point to make, even though, of course, it's not even barely hinted in the Bible. The Bible does tell us about the loathsome practice of child sacrifice, but it doesn't say that Ruth rejected that practice in order to marry a Judean. That's the free invention of this. Now, how does Machlon die? In the Bible, we don't know. He dies. But here, he dies in an attempt to escape right, from the cruelty of the Moabites. And she really only marries him at the last minute. We don't know that from the Bible either. So to think that she follows Naomi after having only been a married woman for minutes, that makes it even more extraordinary. And then we get to the next part of the movie version, which is so different from the Bible. It turns out that Boaz has a whole arc of character development that's missing in the Bible. In the Bible, we meet him and he's a good man at the beginning, and he's a good man at the middle, and he's a good man at the end. In the movie, he starts off being somewhat checkered, somewhat chauvinistic and xenophobic. He doesn't like Moabites. Apparently, there's been a lot of Hatfield and McCoy bad blood between the Judeans and the Moabites, and we learn that from the backstory here. But Boaz shows a pretty harsh face at the beginning, and he's willing to let Ruth glean, but not more than that. And so their relationship starts out not so good at all, which is part of the Hollywood formula, because if they're going to end up happily ever after, they're going to start off not liking each other. Just think of proud Mr. Darcy and spunky Lizzie Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, right? She doesn't like proud Mr. Darcy at the beginning of the Jane Austen novel, right? It's got to start off negative so that there can be a significant development towards the positive. That's the way we tell stories. So Hollywood takes that famous formula and it applies it here too. So at first, Ruth would rather not have anything more to do with Boaz, and he doesn't want to have anything more to do with her. So Boaz's kinsman, Mr. So-and-so, Ploni Almoni, ends up having a name in the movie. Do you remember his name? Tov. I've never met anyone, I know Hebrew, I think you know that. I've never met anyone with the name Tov. Tov means good. Now, in Puritan America, there's good man and good woman, right? Goody two-shoes, right? Young Goodman Brown, I think, is a Nathaniel Hawthorne story, right? So, and in other languages, good is a name. I had a grandmother whose Yiddish name was Gittel, which means goody, a good woman. So that's a name in certain languages, but I've never heard it as a name in Hebrew. But that never stopped Hollywood. So they give him the symbolic name of Tov, good. And he starts off seeming very good, but he's not so very good by the end of it, right? Whereas Boaz starts off being not so good, and he ends up being very good by the end of it. So that leads us to an interesting problem. Tov wants to marry Ruth. And why does he want to marry her? Because she's gorgeous. Really, they picked one of the most beautiful 19-year-old actresses they could find, right? Now, granted, I used to be a guidance counselor, and I worked in a high school setting. And I would see these 17-year-old girls who were so upset because they thought they were the ugliest girl in their class. And I couldn't say this, but I wanted to say to them, by virtue of being 17, you're probably in the top 10% of beautiful women in the world today. So you have a small sample of another dozen or 2 dozen classmates, and you don't think you stack up to them. You should only know. 99+% of the world's males think that you're the most gorgeous thing they've ever seen. Nonetheless, the movie makers found an extraordinarily good-looking actress to be the Ruth. And the character of Tov is impressed by that. So unlike Boaz in the Bible, who is impressed by her goodness, Tov in the Hollywood stories is impressed by her good looks. So there's something shallow and superficial about him, and we see that right away. And it gets worse. He's the guy who drinks too much at the party. Remember the scene where he kind of like drinks himself into a stupid stupor, right, at the party. And he negotiates with Naomi, and he claims his right to marry her. And in the climax scene, she says to him, you want me to be honest with you, don't you? He says, of course. She says, well, honestly, I don't love you. And he says, well, that's all right, you'll grow to love me. Which sounds a little bit like Tevye and Goldie in Fiddler on the Roof, right? How did I know if I was going to love you? I first met you under the wedding canopy. I was nervous, I was shy, I was timid, so was I. Do you love me? Remember that scene? Do I what? Who knew from love? You get married and then you fall in love 25 years later, right? Maybe. But love is the cherry on top of the ice cream. It's not the main thing, right? So she says, I don't love you. And he says, that's all right. Maybe you'll come to love me. And then she says, in the spirit of honesty, I'm going to tell you something else. I spent last night with Boaz. And he thought what maybe some of you thought. He said, well, in that case, I don't want used goods. So he rejects her for the Hollywood reason. Explicitly not what the Bible tells us, right? The Bible tells us that Mr. So-and-so felt he couldn't afford to marry her. He could afford the act of charity of buying this field and giving it back to Naomi. He's not a bad man, right? He's a charitable man, but up to a point. And his limits were less than what was demanded of him. So he forfeits his chance to marry Ruth in the Bible, and Boaz happily takes that honor upon himself. And we know from the biblical genealogy that ends the story, that was the right choice, and God smiled upon that. But in the movie version, Tov rejects Ruth because he thinks that she's been unfaithful, that she's been promiscuous, that she did on the threshing floor what maybe you thought she was going to do on the threshing floor. Or that Boaz did on the threshing floor what you thought maybe Boaz would do on the threshing floor. And then Ruth and Boaz in the movie go before the local magistrate. There's a couple of scenes where we see the magistrates, and they promise that they did nothing intimate when they were together. They take an oath on that, and so she's not a disgraced woman, and they're allowed to be married, and they are married, and they're also very happy. So notice how the movie makers have taken the various scenes of the Bible and amplified them in different ways, some of which are completely conventional Hollywood stories. The love triangle is a conventional story. The theme of sexual jealousy is a very, very much of a Hollywood theme. But they've also infused the story with some interesting theological ruminations. Hasn't God been watching over this woman from the very beginning? The rash on her arm when she's a little girl. Hasn't God been guiding her steps so that ultimately she would marry Boaz? Because that's precisely the match made in heaven that will ultimately give us King David. That's the movie's take on this. And that's not just Hollywood. See that? There's something more serious about it. So now I want to move back to this notion of the holy man. This is the part that's, as opposed to what's merely not biblical, this is really not biblical. The holy man starts off the film. He's the first person you see and shows us this sleepy little town of Bethlehem. I don't mean Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Right? I mean the original Bethlehem. Oh, little town of Bethlehem. Right? Is anyone here from New Jersey? Do you know the Tom Lehrer satirical song, Oh, little town of Hackensack? Oh, little town of Bethlehem. Of course, very, very famous from the Christian core story, right? Yeah. Very famous. So the holy man, who's the narrator, the first person we see, shows us the town of Bethlehem long before it became famous. Right? long before it began. It's a sleepy little crossroads town. It's the Pungo of Judah. You know, there's a market there, but not much else. So he says, long before it became famous, meaning long before Jesus is born there, certain important things happened here. That's how the story is framed. At the very, very end, the holy man is the last person you see also. And he's just kind of like smiling, God, you pulled it off. And in between, he has one other very important appearance, this holy man, who's also not in the biblical story of Ruth. At a certain point when Naomi is just overcome with sadness, that Ruth is going to be forced into an unhappy marriage. And her heart grieves for Ruth because, you know, women didn't have escape clauses. They had very few options in that society. And Naomi is just crushed, and her sadness overwhelms her. And you know, she's down in the dust. And just then you see the holy man again. And he says to her, fear not, Naomi. It's all going to work out well. She's going to marry Boaz, and they're going to have a descendant who will be the king of Israel. And then there'll be a later descendant whom some will acclaim as the Messiah. That's the Christian interpretation. See that of the book of Ruth right there. Because once you say David, you're probably thinking of the opening paragraph of the Gospel according to Matthew, where we have the genealogy that goes from David down to Jesus. See that? So we go from Abraham to Judah, and Judah to David, and then from David down to Jesus as well. So the holy man shows up about 2/3 of the way through the movie to assure Naomi that all this is part of God's plan. So that's why the holy man frames the entire story. You see him at the beginning, you see him at the end. Now, I should tell you that the story of Ruth did not achieve cinematic success the way that some of the other Bible retellings achieved. It got middling reviews, maybe because it didn't have that much spectacle. Right? So some of the secret of the movies that really brought down the house were the ones that had huge spectacles, and I'll give you 2 examples of it. Does anyone remember the scene of the destruction of the Philistine temple in Samson and Delilah? DeMille had his stagecraft people build this like 30-some foot high replica of a temple, and then they demolished it, you know, with the spectacular cinematography. You've got, you know, Samson pushing against the pillars, and they're beginning to creak, and everyone is shrieking and running, and so on and so forth. So that's spectacle. And that spectacle is small potatoes compared to the dividing of the Red Sea, right? Which is the money shot for all these Bible movies, right? So the book of Ruth doesn't have that. Because after all, the book of Ruth is not about that kind of miracle. It's about the quiet miracle. God behind the scenes, helping 2 people's steps to converge so that good things can come from that. Now, you and I might say that's a wonderful miracle, but it's not a telegenic miracle. Right? It's not a cinematic miracle in the same sense. So Ruth is awfully good looking, and Boaz ain't bad. By the way, Boaz is probably much younger than he is in the real Bible story, but the Stuart Whitman actor who portrays Boaz, let me just say, he's no Charlton Heston. And he's no Victor Mature either. Right? So he's not one of these high-temperature heartthrobs from Hollywood. So maybe that was the reason why. But it's a lovely story. I can tell you, I've watched the film version numerous times, and it's one of the films that I tend to like more with successive viewings. At first I watched it and I said, this holy man is totally extraneous, and what do they need that for? And then when I began to study the film, I thought, beyond the conventional, beyond the typical Hollywood stuff, there are some points in it that amply repay the experience of watching it. So I hope that you've enjoyed it. And I can tell you it's in some ways more understated than the previous films that we saw. And it's certainly more understated than the Esther story that we're going to see. That has some big moments again. And it's probably a good idea that we're finishing with the Esther movie rather than the Ruth movie. But this one has its delights the same way that a charming minuet third movement of a four-movement symphony, is very lovely in its position there. And then you have the grand finale in the last movement as well. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll enjoy our next one too. And thank you so much for your attention. And I purposely concluded so there'd be time for some questions.
Yes, we will have a question and answer session now. So if you would like to have a question or comment, please raise your hand, and then I'll give you the microphone. And would you also then state your name, or at least your first name, before you give your question or your comment? Who is first? And I'll step to the side so I can see everyone better and see who's raising their hand. All right, we have...
It's always the hardest one to get the first one, so
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, would you pass the
let's give you
microphone through, please?
Okay, I'm kidding. There were two things that that are not even part of the scripture. Number one, the two brothers, we never knew which of the two were married to either Ruth or Oprah. It just says there were two boys and there were two girls and they were married to each other.
In the Bible.
But we never knew
That's
who
correct.
belonged to whom.
That's correct.
And then the very last scene, when Tob threw his shoe at Boaz, and that was a very peaceful
Exactly.
relationship, and they killed it for me.
Shall we say they took liberties?
Yeah.
Well, there's no question but that this film takes more liberties with the original story than some other films do. Although, in some ways, to me, the point isn't whether or not the film takes liberties. The point is, what's it trying to do with the liberties that it takes? Now, let's look at that example of taking off the sandal. In this film, it's a gesture of extreme exasperation, right? Even anger. The Bible doesn't indicate that. The Bible indicates that it's a formal gesture of a legal. But is there maybe some biblical evidence to suggest that there's something negative about this? And it turns out that there is. If we go back to the book of Deuteronomy, the law of the levirate husband, what if he says no? Now, this is not in the story of Ruth, but it's the one other time a sandal is taken off. The woman takes off her sandal, she spits in it, and he takes off his sandal, she spits in it, and forever he's known by the term of shame. His family is the house of the unshod sandal. So the Bible is trying to indicate something negative about that, not the story of Ruth. The story of Ruth just treats it as a legal nicety. But in the book of Deuteronomy, it does have a negative valence, so who knows? Now, as for the anonymity of the two brothers, I completely agree with you. We don't know which one is Machlon, which one is Chilion. One of the general rules of interpretation of the Bible by later thinkers and later artists is that they fled away from the anonymity that the Bible sometimes gives us. Case in point, the daughter of Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 2. We don't know her name. The daughter of Pharaoh. In fact, in all of chapter 2 of Exodus, no one has a name before Moses gets a name. A man from the house of Levi married a daughter of Levi, and they had a son, and hid him for 3 months. And then when they could hide him no longer, the sister watched over him when he was in a basket in the Nile where the mother had put him. And the daughter of Pharaoh finds him and sends her handmaid to fetch him. And so on and so forth. You have about 8 verses or so, and no one's name is given until the daughter of Pharaoh says, I name him Moses. To me, that's like those black and white photos where one person is colorized, right? Where everything else is black and white, no one else has a name, and this name is in floodlights, Moses, right? So the Bible has artistic reasons for withholding names, but later interpreters somehow don't like that. They're always giving names to the anonymous characters of the Bible. The Bible does this over and over again. Joseph is looking for his brothers at the beginning of Genesis chapter 37. His father tells him to go find the brothers. They're off shepherding somewhere. And he gets lost, and he encounters a man. Who's that man? What's his name? Bible doesn't care to tell you. All the later commentators come, oh, is this person? Oh, is that person? They don't like the anonymity. And the other Bible movies are guilty of the same thing. We have no biblical record of a Princess Nefertari. Or, as the Charlton Heston movie says, Mehmet is the handmaiden of the daughter of Pharaoh. We don't know that from the Bible. So I agree with you that the biblical record keeps the precise relationship fairly anonymous. And all I can say is that this is not the Lone Ranger. They all do it. But thank you so much for the question. Thank you. Another question?
Yeah, other questions or comments? Please raise your hand. Going once. Going twice. All right, we do have one there. Very good. I'll come this
Good
way.
evening.
Everybody probably knows this.
There you go.
Thank you. Who wrote Esther? I mean, the study we're talking about tonight.
Well, tonight we're doing the book of Ruth.
Ruth, yes, who wrote Ruth?
Oh, you're asking a very good question. The books of the Bible, the books of the Hebrew Testament, don't all clearly have their authors named. We know, for example, that the prophets are associated with their books of prophecy, like Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, right? And in one instance, the book of Lamentations, poems over the destruction of the temple, are attributed to Jeremiah. But mostly because of only one chapter in that 5-chapter book, chapter 3, as opposed to chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 4, or chapter 5. But in the case of Ruth, it's totally anonymous. And it gets more complicated. The book of Ruth is set in the time of the Judges, which is why in the standard Christian order of the books of the Bible, it's next to the book of Judges. After the book of Judges, before the book of Samuel. In the Hebrew Bible, it's in the last part of the Bible. Somehow the rabbis were aware of the fact that this doesn't fit quite smoothly into its time period. When we study the book of Ruth from a linguistic standpoint, the particular nuances of the Hebrew in the original book of Ruth, while it's not 100% clear, we don't have a scholarly consensus about this, but there's a preponderance of opinion that the book of Ruth was probably written late in the Bible period, probably during the Second Temple period. It was after most of the other books of the Bible. The same way that an author today might choose to set a story in Civil War America or the time of the Puritans. You know, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who lives in the 1800s, tells the Scarlet Letter, right, which is set in the 1600s. So people will write stories and set them in earlier time periods. That happens often enough. So scholars believe that an anonymous author living in the time of the Second Temple told the story of Ruth, and for a particular point. If you look at other books from the Second Temple period, such as the book of Ezra, there's a kind of a narrow focus on the ethnicity of the Judeans who have gone back from the Babylonian exile back to Jerusalem. And the author of the book of Ezra frowns upon the fact that some of the men of the returning exiles married some of the local women rather than marrying fellow exiles who'd come back with them. So there's a kind of a sense that you're not marrying the right person. It's like, Tony and Maria again. You're marrying outside the group you're supposed to be marrying. Whereas the book of Ruth seems to be giving us the opposite point of view. Ruth is from Moab. Moab originally was a child of incest. You know the story about the birth of Moab and the birth of Ammon? Oh, it's a shameful story. Lot, remember the nephew of Abraham, Lot? Lot is willing to sacrifice the virtue of his 2 unmarried daughters to the fury of the mob, which is gathered around his house and said, "Who are these strangers?" We know they were angels, right? "Who are these strangers who've come and sheltered under your roof? Bring them out and we'll get to know them," whatever that might mean, right? So Lot says, "Oh, don't do that. I have my duties as a host. Here, have your way with my daughters," which is a pretty horrible thing to say also, right? So what happens at the end of the story? God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt. Remember that? Hypertension. You got to watch your sodium intake. Lot's wife. So they end up sheltering in this little cave, and Lot's 2 unmarried daughters say, "The world has ended, and humanity is going to go extinct, and there's no men for us. How are we going to keep humanity from going extinct? The only sperm donor left in the world is our father." So the older one says, "I'll sleep with him tonight, you sleep with him tomorrow night." And they both get him so drunk that he doesn't know what he's doing. Now, it's been said that alcohol increases the desire but decreases the performance. Have you heard of that? Apparently with Lot, it didn't decrease his performance at all. Because he unknowingly, he sleeps with his older daughter the first night, he sleeps with his second daughter. By the way, that's already pretty impressive. His recovery time is pretty good for an old geezer. We got to admit this, let's be honest about it. So, and it only takes one, it's just like you told your kids before senior prom. It only takes one time and you can become a parent. Don't think the odds are on your side. So one time with one daughter, one time with the other daughter, and they each conceive. And the first one gives birth to a son and calls him Ammon, and the second one gives birth to a son and calls him Moab. Now, Av means father, and the M means from. So Moab means from the father. That's what that name means. In other words, child of incest. So, we don't have very high opinion of Moab in the Bible. But the author of the book of Ruth says, don't condemn the children for the sins of the parents. This woman of the stock of Moab is as good as they get. Don't blame her for something in her distant past. She's a beautiful soul. God knows that you should know it too. So that seems to be the agenda of the author of the book of Ruth. Thank you so much for the question, because it gave me the chance to say something important about the biblical story. I appreciate the question. Thank you. Okay, I see we've reached the hour. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to chat with you. And what you may want to do is look at the book of Esther. That's also a sexy story. In a slightly different way. And Esther really is a beauty queen. in addition to all the other sterling qualities that she has. As we'll see, it's not just good looks, but that didn't hoit, as we say in Brooklyn. A good night, everyone.